So I'm Tom Raff. I'm one of the co-conveners of the seminar. I'll be chairing the discussion today. And it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce our two speakers and our discussant today. First of all, we have Dr. Ariadna Acevedo Rodrigo, who has a PhD from Warwick University. She is currently Associate Professor at Cinestav in Mexico City. With Paulo Alonso, she co-edited a book that was published a couple of years ago called Beyond Alterity, Destabilizing the Indigenous Other in Mexico. And she's also the author of an article in the Hispanic American Historical Review, which I think came out last year, entitled Paying for Progress, School Taxes, Municipal Government, and Liberal State Building, Cuetzalan and Cuacuetla, Mexico, 1876 to 1930. I'm also very pleased to welcome Daniela Marino, who has her PhD from El Colegio de Mexico. She's currently professor researcher at the INA in Mexico City. Dr. Marino is the author of various articles and also the monograph Huixquilucan, Ley y Justicia en la Modernización del Espacio Rural Mexiquense, published in 2016, I believe. So those are our two speakers. I'm also very happy to introduce our discussant, Alejandra Irigoyen, who is currently Associate Professor in the Department of Economic History at the LSE and another co-convener of the seminar. So one more thing to add, I think the discussion is going to be a mixture of Spanish and English, Spanglish, so there'll be something in there for everybody one way or the other. So I hope just everybody's comfortable with that. And that goes for obviously asking questions as well. We'll probably move towards kind of Q&A after about 40 minutes or so, maybe a bit earlier, maybe a bit later. You should feel free to ask a question in person or put it in the chat in either English or Spanish, obviously. So without further ado, over to Alejandra.
Right, I'm trying to pull the slides that the two guest speakers have shared with me or us. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, all of you, for coming. So far, we've had discussions of books in the seminar, and this is not exactly the same, but hopefully it will become a book at some point. I thought that from the research of Daniela and Ariadna, very good synergies can come together and that might make a very good book. So what I will try today is not to discuss the book, but somehow discuss ideas for possibly a book on liberalism and indigenous communities. And it's something that has impregnated the history and the revisionism of the political history of the 19th century. That is something that most of you probably know. It's rooted back in the Cadiz Constitution. There are two very influential views or interpretation of this process. And I would like both speakers here somehow to give us their sort of individual thesis on these matters. And then we would proceed in a conversation with questions, trying to tease out both theses and thinking how to bring them together in what would be ideally a new view or a different view on 19th century liberalism and indigenous agency in Latin America. I'm myself an interloper of more things, as I am an economic historian when they allow me. But from my own research on political economy of the empire, I've seen, and in the transition to independence, I somehow can trace this transition from an order or a colonial rule that contain indigenous communities who obtain or maintain their collective ownership of their land in return for tribute, often taken as a tax, whereas it is a different kettle of fish. This relation with the king established a particular bond between subjects and the royal protection and fuero or privileges, freedoms, as Larry Epstein would say, that somehow sort of shape the relationship in the New World. This is often characterized with a label which I'm not very comfortable with, is this ancien regime. It's very much more, to me, an early modern political economy, but it suffered a major shift with the independence. The post-revolutionary governments tried to reformulate that political and legal bond, now with a new sovereign, not longer the King of Spain, but a republican state. That is, they try to create a new, now national constituency, but based in popular representation rather than some sort of corporate representation. And in so doing, they reformulated also, or they reformed the existing system of property rights to land. Either because of, and we will see, because of some high ideological aims or objectives, or just mere fiscal needs. But this is a process that goes hand in hand with the process of political individuation of agents, now detached out of the colonial order, that establish or aim to establish the fundamentals of a market economy, which is basically unbound private property rights. So I'm very interested in what Ariadna and Daniela can say of this process of coevolution of popular representation on the one hand and full-fledged market relations in the history of 19th century Latin America. This process, in my view, is what in many ways, economic, political, or ideological, is associated with liberalism or modernization. But it's something that goes beyond institutions, ideologies, and this outdated modernization theory. This is a process that also the literature has conceived as a failure of liberalism or the culprit of present day's inequalities. So I just, talking with Daniela and Ariadna, we could sort of flag these two main sources of this in further interpretations. But I would like now to invite Ariadna and Daniela to sum up or summarize their thesis in this regard. Both they have worked in different aspects of this process. So, and then we can start the conversation. So, Ariadna, you want to start?
No, I think it's Daniela who's supposed to start with the previous slide.
Well, then you go. You should sort out the slides in a different manner. Well, then, Daniela, that's your turn.
Bueno, muchas gracias Alejandra y Tom. En primer lugar, disculpas por hablar en español, pero no me siento confortable hablando en inglés. Bueno, aunque a efectos de repartirnos un poco los temas con Ariadna, me voy a enfocar en propiedad, mientras que ella en ciudadanía, pues obviamente son dos temas que van de la mano, muy entrecruzados a lo largo del siglo XIX. Enfocándonos en los pueblos indígenas, bueno, mi región de estudio siempre ha sido el Estado de México. En la primera mitad del siglo XIX es el gran Estado de México, que incluía todavía lo que después van a ser Hidalgo, Morelos, parte de Guerrero. Lo que podemos ver ahí es en la primera mitad del siglo XIX cómo esa idea tan difundida de Anino que Cádiz permitió a los indígenas la autonomía local, convirtiendo sus pueblos de indios en ayuntamientos, pues a medida que ya muy temprano desde la Constitución de 24, las constituciones estatales y las leyes electorales van a impedir la llegada de estos indígenas a los nuevos ayuntamientos, que van a quedar en control de sectores no indígenas, ¿no? De estos riquillos de los pueblos, ¿no? Esos sectores de pequeños comerciantes, pequeños y medianos propietarios, etc. Esto va a provocar que en la segunda mitad del siglo XIX, a partir de la ley Lerdo, la Constitución de 57, y toda una serie de leyes que van a afectar no solo la tierra, sino otro tipo de recursos, van a estar a cargo su implementación, sobre todo de estos sectores no indios de los ayuntamientos, ¿no? Entonces, eso les va a permitir controlar el proceso de desamortización y incluso recibir tierras de estas tierras de comunidad que antes habían pertenecido a los pueblos. Por supuesto hay varias cosas que tenemos que tener en cuenta, ¿no? Por un lado, vamos a encontrar procesos muy diversos, ¿no? No es lo mismo todos estos procesos de desamortización, de división de tierras públicas, etcétera, en regiones con productos de exportación de alta demanda, como el caso que estudió Emilio Curí en Papantla con la vainilla, pero incluso lugares de producción comercializada dentro del mercado interior, como Morelos con el azúcar. Y por supuesto, otros casos se van a dar en regiones de tierras más pobres, de producción para el mercado local, etc. Otra cosa es que no podemos ver aislada la desamortización civil de otro tipo de leyes, como la desamortización eclesiástica, la nacionalización eclesiástica, la división de tierras públicas, la privatización de los ejidos, que va a ser más tardía, va a ser ya en los últimos años de los 80, primeros de los 90, pero que va a tener un efecto mucho más fuerte que la privatización de los terrenos de común repartimiento, y finalmente en el cambio de siglo, las leyes federales sobre centralización y concesión de la explotación del agua y de los bosques, ¿no? Otro elemento que hay que considerar es que, por supuesto, también vamos a encontrar ciertos obstáculos o límites materiales para completar la idea liberal de la pequeña propiedad, ¿no? La falta de información, o sea, la falta de una moderna cartografía, de censos modernos, el primero es de 1895, un registro de tierras, un catastro, la falta de empleados técnicos, como ingenieros, agrónomos, tanto para hacer trabajo de campo como incluso en la misma administración, falta de dinero, de recursos públicos para llevarlo adelante, y esto va a llevar a que la gente local tiene que ser persuadida para que colabore con en primer lugar los municipios, los jefes políticos y las autoridades que tienen que llevar a cabo las tareas concretas de desamortización. Si pasamos a la otra. Bueno, esto va a afectar también, obviamente, o se va a ver afectado por lo que consideramos la transición jurídica, es decir, esa transición desde un sistema de propiedad plural, donde distintos actores tienen diferentes derechos sobre la tierra, de propiedad, de posesión, de usufructo, la tierra que puede estar individualizada o ser de explotación colectiva o estar en posesión de corporaciones, con el dominio eminente que descansa en última instancia sobre la corona, que puede dar o quitar esos derechos, hacia un sistema de la propiedad liberal, es decir, la propiedad individual, titulada, donde existen títulos no disputados sobre quién tiene la propiedad de una determinada parcela. Esta transición, por supuesto, va a ser una transición muy difícil de cumplir, al punto que cuando hay una nueva transición hacia el sistema postrevolucionario en el siglo XX, todavía no se había completado la transición hacia el sistema liberal. Por supuesto que en esta transición el hecho de abolir la personalidad legal de los actores colectivos, como los pueblos, pero no solamente los pueblos, los municipios también, por ejemplo, en temas de tierras, no ayudó a resolver las disputas por la propiedad, ¿no? En principio, los litigios sobre propiedad se tenían que resolver en juzgados. Era un tema judicial, no administrativo. Y el hecho de quitar la personalidad jurídica a los pueblos, e incluso al municipio que a través del síndico podría haber gestionado esa participación jurídica, supone un obstáculo, porque los indígenas iban a tener que presentarse de manera individual para disputar la propiedad. Sin embargo, lo que hemos demostrado en nuestro libro es que los tribunales probaron ser una importante arena para disputar los temas de propiedad, pero sobre todo para permanecer las comunidades, los pueblos, como actores políticos y jurídicos. Lo que vemos en las leyes liberales es que finalmente lo que están haciendo es imponer nuevas reglas sobre la propiedad de la tierra. Es como barajar y dar de nuevo, ¿no? Entonces, en esas nuevas reglas, personas que podían estar muy seguras de su posesión han perdido esos derechos, o sus derechos han perdido legitimidad, mientras que otros que usaban la tierra pero no se consideraban propietarios, de pronto se ven en situación de poder pedir esa propiedad para sí mismos. Entonces, las nuevas leyes liberales obviamente van a definir una arena contenciosa en torno a la propiedad, y esas leyes liberales van a ser usadas para defender, para confirmar, para obtener, para pedir tierras que anteriormente podían estar en otras manos, independientemente de la ideología de los litigantes, ¿no? Es decir, por ejemplo, un concepto que para el liberalismo va a ser muy importante a la hora de definir la propiedad es el del uso, el usufructo, quién usaba la tierra. Y eso va a llevar a que los arrendatarios de tierras corporativas de pronto van a adquirir derecho a la propiedad de esas tierras. Al mismo tiempo que las corporaciones van a tener que vender esas tierras, ¿no?, a los arrendatarios. Ahora, dentro de las comunidades, por ejemplo, sabemos había distintos tipos de tierras, ¿no? Los lotes familiares, los que se llamaban terrenos de común repartimiento, que eran pequeñas o micro parcelas para sembrar los bienes de subsistencia, van a ser mantenidos por estas familias que van a recibir un título de propiedad privada sobre esas tierras. Pero los propios, es decir, otro tipo de terrenos que pertenecían o al municipio o a algún pueblo dentro del municipio, y que generalmente eran rentados para obtener recursos, pues van a perder esos derechos de propiedad sobre los propios. Otro tipo de tierras que eran los ejidos, que eran esos terrenos que todos los habitantes podían usar, como podía ser un llano pastal, donde llevar a pastar el ganado, o un bosque de donde obtener madera y productos de recolección. Estos van a tener que ser divididos entre todos los hombres adultos que eran quienes usaban de esas tierras, ¿no? Y cuando no se reparten, van a ser puestos en subasta. Entonces, son estos aspectos que quiero por ahora dejar planteados, y le doy la palabra a Ariadna para esperar luego las preguntas.
Thank you, Daniela. That's the one. Well, I'm going to try and be very brief. I just want to drop some ideas and questions. I tried to prepare a PowerPoint slide that has broader questions that Daniela has just talked about. Well, because of the online format, and also because we have a wonderful audience, and I'm actually more interested in listening to Alejandra and to our audience than I am in listening to myself. But anyway, I'm supposed to talk, so I will. I start this slide with a rather obvious sentence, but I will say why I think it's important. I say liberalism excluded indigenous peoples as collective or corporate actors, but not as individuals. It made them citizens. It's worth repeating this because although this is obvious from the legislation, it is very common, particularly in in Mexico, and not only among the students, but also with the specialists, it's still very common to hear people in conferences and to read books' conclusions in which the 19th century is still mainly about the exclusion of indigenous peoples. Even after all the subaltern agency and all the popular politics literature, I believe there's still a tendency, and I believe it's stronger in the literature in Spanish than in the literature in English, to conclude with the idea that liberalism basically was a complete disaster for indigenous peoples. Current literature by 20th century historians and also by social in Mexico interested in racism and anti-racism also tend to have this view of the 19th century, and I completely disagree with them. So one of the ideas I've been trying to use against this argument is that one important thing is that degrees of inequality in the way that citizenship is implemented, and degrees of social and economic inequality as well, vary greatly from place to place in Mexico. And it's important to not leave out the cases that I call cases of subordinate inclusion. And I'm borrowing this term from Fiona Wilson and Lucy Taylor, who used it years ago to talk about citizenship in Latin America. Cases of what I put here as ruthless exploitation or more straightforward exclusion, I think, for people who know Mexican history, late 19th century Chiapas, I think, is a great example of this. Cases of subordinate inclusion, I think Estado de Mexico, which is studied by Daniela Marino, is a good case. Oaxaca is probably a good case as well. The Puebla Sierra, which I've studied, is a good case of that. I won't go into that, but we can talk about the differences between those when we go into the questions. Now, what we have had in the last 20 or maybe even 30 years is plenty of literature talking about appropriation of liberalism by indigenous peoples. And by liberalism, I include in liberalism popular sovereignty, military recruitment, taxation, universal suffrage, and schooling. And I think we're still lacking an overarching debate about what can we conclude from the huge amount of case studies that we've amassed in the last 30 years. We have very different results in very different regions, and I think it's very difficult to paint the broader picture. There is a widespread kind of agreement between historians that some of the outcomes of this implementation of liberalism are hybrid rather than strictly liberal. I'm very dissatisfied with this answer by now. At the beginning, when historians started talking about syncretism and hybridity, you know, the fact that liberalism didn't change everything, like didn't start from a clean slate, and therefore there was a lot of persistence of colonial legacies and so on. At the beginning, when we started talking about hybridity, it helped to see that actually liberalism did bring changes. But the idea that this is all a bit of a mix, even though it could be argued with concrete evidence, I think makes it quite complicated to create a debate where we can discuss what the different case studies tells us, what are the different results, and how can we characterize the different examples, in which cases which liberal institutions were relatively successful and which weren't. And I think we still need to talk about that. So one of my questions is, we need to ask, I believe, whether the new adapts to the old or the old to the new, because I also find, I think there's a tendency in the literature to overemphasize persistence of the old if we're studying, especially if we're studying former Indian republics, which become municipalities in the 19th century, as Daniela has explained, and which are often referred to as indigenous communities, using more the 20th century term than the colonial term. And my view is that this tendency to overemphasize old legacies has blinded us to changes that have been more profound than we think, if we need to take about overall. And of course, this is all very different from one region to another, and whether we're looking at one institution, elections, another institution, the army, taxes, etc. I also think that the emphasis on subaltern agency has led to a focus on indigenous participation in state building, but has sometimes neglected to renew our analysis of old and new socioeconomic and political inequalities. Too much emphasis, too much celebration of popular agency leave us with a narrative that might have difficulties in explaining why are these people still subordinated, how are old and new inequalities reproduced. And I think that we have a confusion with, you know, what other inequalities we can observe, say, by the end of the 19th century are due to persistence of colonial hierarchies, and which ones are actually due to new liberal logics and new market logics, well, working out and producing certain inequalities. So my last point is just the need for greater focus on long-term institutional history and for more systematic dialogue between economic and political historians. So I'm very happy to have Alejandra with us. I still got a lot to learn from her work. Also, we need more dialogue between those looking at reforms from above and those looking at reforms from below. We do read each other, but we don't have a proper debate that really connects one literature to the other. When I read people who look at reforms from above, I often find the work that Daniela and I and everyone doing popular politics does in the footnotes, but I often find they're kind of misinterpreting us anyway. And that's all on my side as a call for dialogue. And I think Alejandra will intervene now.
Right. Well, thank you both for the effort to summarize very big themes and topics, which moreover, as you both say, has so many local specificities. So Daniela very quickly went through the different processes of privatization of corporate, communal, or free land. And I know she has worked mainly on Mexico, but she has a very good article with a colleague on a comparative framework. And I think it's the way to tackle the point that Ariadna was making about zooming out of the specific cases. So I'd like to ask Daniela if it's possible, within the constraints of the time, if you can describe summarily to what extent these sort of changes transform the existing property rights, the non-market, say, to indicate as different from the private, more capitalist, modern, and how this affected the autonomy and the governance of these communities. Just to focus on the indigenous communities or municipalidades. Then I will ask the political aspect of that, of the individuation to Ariadna. But Daniela, could you make a scheme or a bullet point of the changes, if any?
Sí, gracias Alejandra. Bueno, un punto que no debemos perder de vista es esto que yo mencionaba de las restricciones materiales, de los obstáculos materiales para llevar adelante la desamortización, y que son los mismos que ahora nos impiden a nosotros cuantificar esos procesos. Entonces, excepto por el caso muy bien estudiado de Papantla por Emilio Curí, que él tuvo la ventaja de encontrar, ¿no?, una fuente, digamos, los registros del notario, que un notario había hecho prácticamente el registro de todas, de la desamortización de todo el cantón, y fue además una desamortización que se hizo en solo 2 momentos. En general, para el resto de México no tenemos esas fuentes registrales, no tenemos esas fuentes cuantitativas, ¿no? Entonces, es difícil ser más preciso, digamos, sobre estos procesos, ¿no? Lo que tenemos sí es una gran diversidad. Tenemos una gran diversidad, como yo había dicho, tanto en regiones de agricultura comercial, que obviamente se privatizaron mucho más rápido y de manera más completa. De hecho, por ejemplo, en Morelos, los pueblos pierden sus tierras por parte de las haciendas azucareras, mucho antes de que se promulgue la ley Lerdo, ¿no? Para cuando se promulga la ley de Lerdo, los pueblos de Morelos ya no tienen tierras prácticamente. Entonces, un punto muy importante es eso, la característica, la posibilidad de comercializar los productos de esas tierras, ¿no? En las regiones de productos para el mercado interno, para el consumo de la población, es mucho más fácil que se mantuvieran algunas tierras comunales. Por supuesto que sí van a perder algunas. Como dije, en ese proceso, los terrenos de común repartimiento los van a mantener en principio las familias, aunque una vez que tienen título de propiedad, por supuesto que pueden venderlo a otras personas. Pero en principio ese tipo de tierras los mantienen. Los propios, muchos de ellos los van a perder, y los ejidos recién es hacia fines del siglo, cuando se da este proceso de dividir los ejidos entre todos los habitantes de cada pueblo, ¿no? Cada uno de los pueblos dentro del municipio tenía un llano pastal o un monte, que se va a repartir entre los habitantes indios y no indios. Ahí es donde entran estos otros grupos de población a obtener tierras de la comunidad. No es tan cierta esa idea de la historiografía anterior respecto a de que los pueblos perdieron todas sus tierras en manos de las haciendas, pues no es tan cierta. De hecho, a muchas de las haciendas le convenía que estos indígenas tuvieran una tierra de donde sacar su alimentación durante todo el año, y los ocupaban solo en épocas de cosecha, o digamos como empleados temporales, ¿no? Entonces había una simbiosis funcional, digamos. Entonces, ¿en qué medida esto afecta la autonomía comunal? Bueno, yo sigo esa hipótesis de Bernardo García Martínez. A mí me gusta mucho esta idea de que estos procesos en la segunda mitad del siglo XIX van a hacer que lo que después los antropólogos llaman comunidad se mantienen en algunos de estos barrios al interior del municipio. Aquellos que tenían una fuerte población indígena y que logran mantener algunos bienes de explotación comunal, y junto con eso van a mantener también algunos cargos, algunas estructuras de elección, de toma de decisiones de tipo comunitario. Pero no podemos generalizar. Por ejemplo, Oaxaca yo creo que es el caso más exitoso de la primera mitad del siglo XIX, por lo menos, de retener la autonomía local junto con los bienes. En la primera mitad del siglo XIX, ya con Edgar Mendoza, vemos que en la segunda mitad, pues ese proceso se va a ir perdiendo, no así un poco la autonomía local, ¿no? La gran fragmentación municipal que tuvo Oaxaca, yo creo que no se compara en el resto de la República. Por otra parte, Ariadna nos muestra en la Sierra Norte de Puebla casos exitosísimos de negociación política, ¿no? En fin, creo que son procesos bastante varios. No sé si te contesté, si te aclaré algo o te compliqué más.
Porque eso me da exactamente la oportunidad de preguntarle a Ariadna, y también, digamos, tratando de... Dijiste Oaxaca y me acordé de las cosas de Karen Kaplan, y,
Claro.
o Guardino, y y mencionabas a Ariadna y el trabajo de Puebla, y quería preguntarle a Ariadna, entonces, digamos, un poco desde su análisis y su mirada sobre la generación o la emergencia de esta agencia, o de individualización de la agencia política, y digamos de la separación del individuo de las comunidades, los pueblos, y pensé en las municipalidades también. Quería pedirle a Ariadna exactamente lo mismo, digamos, en este proceso de individuación of the political subject. I don't know what language I'm speaking, but in this process of individualization, how can you sum up or you know, describe this process? Tell us a little bit more in detail, and you know, if you can bring comparison between Oaxaca and Puebla, for instance, and northern Puebla.
Yes, well, it's a difficult question because it's very broad, and I'm actually going to be talking about other people's research rather than my own, but I'm trying to bring it all together on my own argument or interest. And I think my main hypothesis would be that throughout the 19th century, there's a development of more individualistic forms of organization, even that we've thought there has been, like, you know, the discourse of the permanence of certain corporate forms, of local government, for instance, suggests, I think, less individualism than there actually was in many places. And I think the best example is actually private land holding, which, you know, Daniela knows about much more than I do. But, you know, work like Daniela's and Emilio Cori's shows us that private land holding was a lot more common and pervasive even before the Lerdo law that sought to privatize communal land in the 1850s onwards. You know, and the fact that, as Daniela mentioned just before, it is not quite true that dispossession of land was as widespread and complete as you know, the old historiography suggested. So that's one point. Other ways in which I think there is probably more individualistic forms of organization that we have often recognized is in local government and in schools, and I'll briefly describe those. Local government in municipalities which used to be Indian republics in the colonial time, Indian pueblos. Historians have often paid a lot of attention to, you know, whether the corporate legacies are visible, whether there are what anthropologists called cargo systems, or you know, the civil religious hierarchy of posts by which men go through all these posts from very young until they reach the highest point. Well, those who can, not everybody reaches to the top, obviously. And I think there's been another emphasis on this type of persistence of corporate government, and less emphasis on how all the liberal legislation changed this. For instance, I like discussing Villa Alta because it's a case I like summarizing. And in the case of Villa Alta in Oaxaca, Peter Guardino shows how in the 1820s and 1840s, even though this was a district in Oaxaca where there were no strong national links through war or through party membership, and nonetheless, you know, electoral change with male universal suffrage changed local government in really important ways, because the power of the old principales, which were like the old strongmen in the town, although it persisted, it now had to be, now their legitimacy could be questioned by municipal elections, and municipal elections did mean that younger commoners could challenge previous hierarchies of status and previous hierarchies of age. So I think this is, this is the kind of important changes that happen, and it's not just in Villalta, but in many places, and that, because the power of the old principales or the old pasados, which, the post which in principle comes from a colonial legacy, persists, sometimes this is just assessed as a colonial persistence, and then we kind of erase the fact that these old actors had to reconfigure their practices on the very new logics, that were new logics that were created by liberal legislation. And I think is, how the logic of power, of competition between men for, to be elected, etc., changes. So that would be the other one. And then schools are also important, particularly in the last half of the 19th century. And although it was only a small proportion of school-aged children that went to these schools, generally no more than 20% of children, there is a lot of, there's plenty and plenty of documentation in archives that suggest that increasingly teachers and parents were thinking of schooling not only in terms of let's create the literate elite for this town, but also in terms of individual social mobility. And there's plenty of evidence of this, and I think we haven't emphasized it enough. So that's my examples.
And would you say, I recall from our conversations that the recruitment and the enlistment in the National Guard is also, at a local level, is also a means to incorporate these individuals that they are in between these loyalties, right? Or they are moving from different allegiances. Would that play any role, or, well, at least in another process of privatization, in that case of empty land, that was a conduit. Would that be the same for the case of Mexico? Because I'm going to ask Daniela about the comparison with the first and later wave of land reform. But we can associate this in any way?
My sound is it's not great. I'm not sure. I couldn't work out whether the question was for me or Daniela.
No, the question was because we were talking about schooling and educations and the way and different countries to incorporate this individual subjects, now citizens. So I was wondering if the recruitment or the enlistment for National Guards, the transformation of the colonial militias into the local National Guards was another way or could be comparable.
Yes, well, that's a very important question. And there's a bit of that debate there. It's a bit difficult to summarize, but we'd have to think of the army as in attempts at universal recruitment, but also the National Guards, which were much more locally and regionally focused. And then there were also the civic militias. And I think it remains to be discussed to what extent they contributed to a process of individualization. I think the main debate, well, one of the main debates I can see related to this at the moment, maybe Timo Schaffer is there, or many other people out there in the audience that may know more than me about this, but a debate I see is whether, for instance, civic militias and National Guards produce the kind of individualization and state building that universal recruitment does, or whether it's completely different. I don't think it's that different, but it's not the same either. So I'll leave the question open there. For the case of the Puebla Sierra, which Guy Thompson has studied in depth, I think National Guards were very important in linking indigenous individuals and communities to state building through war. I think he's demonstrated that quite clearly. And it's the same in Oaxaca, where they recruited National Guards. But, you know, other regions have different experiences.
Well, that's, you know, pulls me to ask Daniela about, you know, she went very quickly about the different reforms, and I made that argument of the incorporation to the revolutionary armies as a way for entitlements, as a way to make it for lack of money or means. Yeah, that were the 1810s or so, and mainly in the River Plate. But you know, the reforms of the 1850s or 60s in Colombia, for instance, even, you know, the ones in Argentina with a different kind of assets. I wonder to what extent are comparable to the earlier one, Daniela. Can you elaborate more on in this regards, and how to incorporate the subjects or the citizens now in the second wave of reforms that you know better? Oh, open your micro. Abre el micrófono.
Perdón. Obviamente que el objetivo liberal, o por lo menos así lo expresaban los liberales, era que convertir a los indígenas en pequeños propietarios era, junto con la escuela, muy difícil de extender en esa época, era la manera de convertirlos en ciudadanos. En ese sentido sí se veía la propiedad, la pequeña propiedad sobre todo, como una vía a la ciudadanía de la población indígena. El proceso no se llevó así de la misma manera, ¿no? Tenemos que, en ese sentido, podemos diferenciar, por ejemplo, lo que fue la desamortización eclesiástica, que se hizo muy rápida, que terminó esas tierras en muy pocas manos, malbaratándolas en el contexto de la guerra de reforma, con el proceso de la desamortización civil, que fue un proceso muy, muy largo. Como yo dije, o sea, llega la revolución de 1910 y no se había concluido la transición hacia un sistema liberal de propiedad. Todavía tenemos comunidades con tierras. Entonces, bueno, no es el tema de esta charla, pero obviamente también esa nueva movida postrevolucionaria, con lo que supuso la reforma agraria de la segunda década del siglo XX, viene todavía a añadir nuevos títulos legítimos de propiedad y a meter todavía más desorden en el registro de esta propiedad. Y es un proceso además muy largo, contencioso. Eso no quiere decir que todos los indígenas rechazaron, por supuesto, la privatización, para nada. Tenemos casos donde la desamortización es vista como una manera de poder mantener las tierras, ¿no? Por medio de su titulación. Pero sí es un proceso muy largo y es un proceso contencioso y que va a ocupar los tribunales de los distintos órdenes, ¿no? Incluso desde los juzgados conciliadores, legos municipales, que van a subsistir hasta la década de 1940 más o menos, hasta las sucesivas instancias, de primera instancia, segunda, hasta la Suprema Corte por medio del recurso de amparo, ¿no? Entonces, ¿de qué manera la desamortización favoreció la ciudadanización? Bueno, no podemos estar muy seguros, ¿no? Todavía, como digo, todavía hasta la revolución tenemos un porcentaje, pero altísimo, abrumador, de población rural analfabeta, ¿no? Y yo creo que sobre todo esta desamortización en los pueblos sí sirvió para consolidar ciertos sectores medios rurales. mestizos, ¿no? Mestizos, no me estoy refiriendo a mestizos étnicamente, pueden ser mestizos también culturales, ¿no? Es decir, pero sobre todo sirvió para eso, para consolidar estos grupos medios locales de pequeños comerciantes, pequeños y medianos propietarios, arrieros, algunos artesanos locales que por medio del acceso a la propiedad pudieron consolidar su situación al interior de esos municipios y ocupar los cargos municipales, ¿no?
Okay, well, I've seen people in the audience that they might have views or even research on other parts of Latin America on this matter. So, Tom, probably you might like to invite people to put questions or make comments. I'm done.
No, I think now is a good time to do that. Thanks so much. That was, I mean, there's an awful lot to chew on there, and yeah, let's take some questions now. As I said before, you're welcome to just chip in the chat or ask on the video. I already have a request from Alan Knight for a question. So, Alan, if you're there, do you want to turn your mic on and ask the first question?
Yep. Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Well, you've raised a lot of interesting questions, and there are so many, it's difficult to know where to focus. And part of the problem, as we all know, is that Mexico is diverse, so you have big regional differences, and also you're dealing with the whole 19th century and things change. And so trying to sort of pull these together and make some sense of it, I wanted to ask Daniela something which puzzled me, the one thing I wasn't sure about, where she seemed to say, I think, that even before the Ley Lerdo, there had been a substantial dispossession of Pueblo land and patrimony in Morelos, which was a more commercialized region, and that this had left the Pueblos substantially deprived of resources. Now, the reason that surprised me is it doesn't quite correspond to what I understood as happening. And if we think of work by lots of people, not just Womack, but Warman and Paul Hart and others, it seems to me that the Porfiriato is fairly crucial. In other words, the desamortization and the loss of land from pueblos to haciendas is somewhat later. And it depends on various factors which really kick in the last quarter or third most of the 19th century. And what that reminds us, which I think is a constant point to remember, is that you can change laws and regulations and even constitutions, but the key thing are what are the drivers on the ground, A, in terms of the politics, which includes military power, and B, in terms of the economic structures and incentives. So it does seem to me that the Porfiriato, and I'm not saying anything very radical or new here, is actually a big sort of parteaguas, because it's the time, A, when the state falls into the hands of different groups, you know, Porfiristas and Científicos and the planters of Morelos and many others. And B, it's a time when demand, not just global demand, but demand Mexico City for sugar and the onset of railways and steam power make possible a sort of new dispensation. So it does seem to me, and that just one last point, if I may, that helps explain something that's a kind of paradox. If you look at the revolution, why are all these peasants, campesinos, many of whom may be Indian, mestizo, we don't always know, why are they going around calling themselves liberals and lauding Juarez, and the Plan of Ayala does it, and many other manifestos? Is there sort of enormous false consciousness because they don't realize the liberals had screwed them through the 19th century? Well, no, not necessarily. There are perfectly good reasons why you could be a Zapatista liberal or a Cedillista liberal, because liberalism for them was not Porfirista, positivist liberalism. It was mid-19th century Juarista liberalism, when as yet that sort of onslaught on the patrimony had not really fully gathered steam. So I think that does help explain something which for a historian of the revolution is quite important.
Bueno, no estoy segura si entendí todo, ¿no? Habla muy rápido, pero es que tengo que decir que yo estudio el Estado de México, no Morelos, entonces no puedo abundar demasiado en Morelos más de lo que he leído, ¿no? Pero sí, por supuesto que el porfiriato va a suponer una acentuación. Bueno, por empezar, la ley Lerdo de 1856, en términos de desamortización civil, no se va a aplicar hasta una vez derrotado el Segundo Imperio, o sea, hasta la República restaurada, después del 67. Lo que se aplica antes es la desamortización eclesiástica, pero la desamortización de los pueblos No es que no se haya aplicado, pero sí tiene un alcance muy, muy limitado antes de la restauración de la paz. Y por supuesto que hay ciertas medidas porfiristas que van a tener mucho más impacto que la ley Lerdo. Esos decretos de desamortización de los ejidos de 1889 y 1890 tienen un efecto mucho más fuerte para los pueblos que la desamortización de los terrenos de común repartimiento, ¿no? El quitarle los montes, el quitarle los llanos pastales va a ser un golpe muy duro para las comunidades. En ese sentido, por supuesto que sí, la desamortización Papantla también va a ser básicamente porfirista, ¿no? Entonces, por supuesto que en porfiriato hay un golpe muy fuerte. Bueno, yo en mi caso de estudio no veo lo que encuentra Ariadna para Sierra Norte de este seguimiento a las ideas de Juárez, de Porfirio, etcétera, sobre todo porque, bueno, Huixquilucan va a ser incendiada 11 veces por el ejército liberal en la guerra de reforma, ¿no? Porque en el Monte de los Cruces se resguardaron los conservadores y ahí mataron a Degollado. Y entonces, digamos, no es un buen lugar para mirar, yo creo, la adhesión liberal. Sin embargo, bueno, no entendí la última parte, no sé si Ariadna quiere seguir esa última parte respecto de Juárez y Porfirio que decía Alan.
Well, I could just say that I think we now have enough evidence to say that more clearly that that the liberalism of peasants in the late 19th and early 20th century is not at all about false consciousness. And well, I mean, Alan said it in the 1980s in his book, but we're having more and more evidence that this is the case. But that for some reason we have to carry on affirming this and saying this, although we got plenty of evidence to prove that actually, well, some were happy with privatization of land, some were happy with the fact that taxes now were for everybody and not just for Indians. It wasn't just tribute. In many regions, it was taxes for everybody, and so on and so forth. Many were happy with municipal elections and with the fact that they could kick out pasados and other older authorities that they didn't want to deal with anymore, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I totally agree that it's not false consciousness at all, but I do wonder what we've been saying this for like 3 decades and 4 decades, and we have to insist. So I think that's my main question.
Okay, thanks everybody. I think my connection's been dropping in and out a bit, but hopefully you can hear me again. So we have time now for more questions. If anybody wants to dive in the chat. I have lots of questions myself.
Go.
Am I permitted to?
Sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm just trying to think about how to make this not a comment and make it a real question. I was interested. I mean, the part of this I know best is around military recruitment. So I thought I might just, and that, it's a very important nexus between indigenous communities and the state, or liberalism. I suppose, Ariadna, you mentioned it's not quite clear how individuation relates to recruitment for the militia and the federal army, and I suppose my question is it really not clear? Because it would be first. I mean, it seems like an interesting question, but a very hard one. Individuation seems to me like a very difficult concept, very abstract and kind of a relative concept. Really, I'm not quite sure how you'd measure it. Maybe you economic historians have a good way of doing that. I'm not quite sure how you do it. But if you mean, does military recruitment kind of substantially change people's identities and loyalties and social behaviour, it would seem to me quite unlikely that federal army recruitment does that, just because it's so unpopular, right? I mean, the last time I looked at this literature, that was one thing that you could see in a number of different case studies. whereas it's much easier to recruit people to local militias or local National Guard units, right? The other reason why I think it's probably quite hard to think about federal recruitment as related to individuation is because if we're thinking about individuation as somebody being sort of separate or not integrated into the community, in a way, in order to be recruited in the first place by the leva, you sort of had to be ostracized anyway. You were often deemed to be undesirable or a sort of an element that was not sort of outside of communal norms, right? So I guess my question is it not quite clear that at least in terms of federal army recruitment, that probably didn't have this sort of individualizing effects?
Yeah, well, I agree with everything you said. That I'm also not sure what individuation means. I think it's very clear that federal recruitment was very unpopular. Therefore, what we need to start thinking about is exactly what impact can we see in all the local militias. And obviously, I mean, some of them were good enough to win wars to the Liberal Party, so that's one important. It also meant, I think, for National Guards, I mean, working for the Liberal Party, I think it meant a considerable empowerment of the communities the National Guardsmen came from. I mean, this has been amply demonstrated by various people, including Guy Thompson and others. The difficulty with this is that then, from the 1880s onwards, people are disarmed and they do lose power and they resist it as well. They try to keep their arms and sometimes they do. But there is, the thing about this is not institutionalized as a link. It doesn't persist as a link between individuals and the state or between communities and the state. So I think that's that's the main problem with it in institutional terms. And I still would not agree with Miguel Ángel Centeno, who in his book about these issues of army, anti-section, blood and war, he seems to completely leave National Guards and civic militias out of the question, because since they're not federal, they're not central, they're not really doing any state building at all for him. I think they are. It's just that in infrastructural terms, it's just they don't leave as lasting a legacy as we would have had if this had been federal and it just stayed. But actually, it was very efficient for the wars that it waged. So yes. Yeah.
Right. Okay. I could talk about that for much longer with you. Maybe we will. But we have another question from Timo. Timo, do you want to dive in?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for those presentations. My question is for Daniela, and it's about land privatization. And I'm afraid it might be another one of those questions that sort of that is almost a comment sort of disguised as a question, but we'll see. And the question is whether the land privatization in the second half of the 19th century, whether we should understand it as a change in property, in the property regime that ruled in Mexico, or whether we should not also, and perhaps more, understand it as a change in the institutions administering property and solving property conflicts. Because before the Ley Lerdo, and by the way, I like very much the distinction you drew between the Ley Lerdo itself, which mostly seems to have affected the tierras de común repartimiento, which already were largely held in private usufruct, and then the later privatization law of the ejidos of the 1880s, which were in terms of property reform, of redistributing property away from indigenous hands, seems to have had a much larger impact. But in both of those cases, it seems to me a significant aspect that is often overlooked in talks about the privatization of indigenous land is that what really changed is that In the first half of the 19th century, it was the indigenous town government itself that was in charge of distributing property, administering property, solving property conflicts, in as far as the magistrates were also judges or justices in the first instance. And then after property was privatized, that power, this is my question, I'm wondering about this, but I have the impression that that power often went away from the local level and came to rest in the hands of jefes políticos, district judges, people more removed from the indigenous community, and often much closer to the interests of, you know, capitalists, agrarian entrepreneurs, and so forth. Is that something that you think that you see and that you find that you would judge significant?
A ver si entendí, Alejandra, tú corrígeme, o Ariadna. Me estás preguntando, es que no veo bien la pregunta. O sea, sí, yo noto con lo que tú dices, que en la primera mitad el control de las tierras estaba en manos de los poderes locales, municipales, sean indígenas o no indígenas, y en cambio en la segunda mitad del siglo vemos una transición hacia cierta centralización, tanto del poder político como de las atribuciones sobre las tierras, ¿no? Que pasan de los municipios a los jefes políticos, gobernadores, la Secretaría de Fomento, etc. ¿Hasta ahí voy bien? Pero no entendí cuál era la pregunta. Bueno, o sea, sí coincido totalmente con eso, pero no entendí si había una pregunta.
Bueno, a mí me parece que eso es un aspecto sobre la privatización de la tierra que era muy significativo en el siglo XIX, pero que muchas veces se excluye de las discusiones que los historiadores ahora tenemos, ¿no? Que se centran mucho en este asunto de la redistribución de la tierra, ¿no? Y muy poco en el control sobre en el control judicial, ¿no? Sobre la administración de la tierra y la propiedad.
Sí, bueno, por eso yo hacía hincapié en el tema de la abolición de la personalidad jurídica, ¿no? De los pueblos, que si bien es algo que está en Cádiz, o sea, ya desde 1812, sin embargo, durante toda la primera mitad del siglo XIX, no se discute que las tierras son de los pueblos. Incluso hasta la ley Lerdo, toda la legislación y las constituciones del Estado de México dan por hecho la existencia de tierras comunales y manejadas por los pueblos. Para hablar del caso que yo conozco mejor, ¿no? Y efectivamente, ya a partir de la restauración de la República, sobre todo, pero bueno, que ya está presente desde la Constitución del 57, es muy claro que no puede haber, que no existe la comunidad. Pero sin embargo, la jurisprudencia que deja sentado esto es de 1882. Es la Suprema Corte dirigida por Ignacio Vallarta, a partir de 5 sentencias de amparo que deja sin lugar a dudas que la comunidad como concentradora de tierras no existe, y que por lo tanto no tiene personalidad jurídica, y eso no quita que los individuos afectados, por más, incluso dice Vallarta, por más que sean muchos, por más que sean lo que antes llamábamos indios, puedan presentarse individualmente considerados ante la Suprema Corte, ¿no? O ante cualquier tribunal a gestionar. Por eso es que aparecen luego los pleitos firmados por 83 vecinos, 144 vecinos, ¿no? Que es la comunidad, pero que no se pueden presentar como tal, ¿no? Pero lo que es muy claro es que eso que supuestamente existía desde 1812, que queda más claro a partir de la Constitución del 57, y sin embargo es hasta la jurisprudencia de 1882 que se pone un parate más firme, y aún así hay que verlo, porque la ley de baldíos de 1894 le restituye, disque temporalmente, a los ayuntamientos la personalidad jurídica para litigar a nombre de sus comunidades. Entonces, obviamente que, por eso yo decía, la no representación colectiva de las comunidades que siguen teniendo propiedades, bueno, supone un escollo muy complicado y por eso después la reforma agraria lo va a quitar del ámbito judicial y lo va a llevar a la presidencia de la República, ¿no? Porque es sumamente contencioso y por más que lo digan las leyes y el ideal liberal, pues no puedes obviar que existen comunidades y que tienen tierras. Pero no sé si te entendí muy bien, Timo, y
No,
hay algo
gracias,
más
muchas
que no estoy
gracias.
contestando.
Sí.
Okay, we have time for maybe one or two more questions if people want to ask them. Or Alejandro, if you want to come in as well.
Well, actually, Timo made apparent what was a bit the answer I had for you about individuation. And it's that, you know, you have 83 individuals who formerly would have been a different collected subject. Now, this individuation is completely an invention of mine because I struggled to identify that. And the alternative was identity, which was even more slippery word. So that is, I mean, I understand your point, Tom, because you are coming from the 20th century. But if you come from the 18th century, there is this transition in which you move from a collective subject to 83 individuals. Now that they are facing a different sovereign. These judges, the judiciary, and the jurisprudencia, they are symptoms or signs of a different state, of a different sovereign, which still in the making, yeah, but it would have been very, very different at the beginning, and 100 years earlier. So the question I have for both presenters, you know, I guess there is a lot to say in revising liberalism and so on. But one thing which I think Tom mentioned in his question is to what extent we can differentiate some sort of drivers of inequality based on the rules of the game, inherential to the new rules of the game, or the inequality that you see developing throughout this process, at least for Mexico. And I'd like to hear Tristan and Rosana Barragan talking about the Bolivia. And so if the inequality, if we have in fact a process of differentiation that is more like the conventional economic inequalities of this new capitalist system. And I'm sounding like Wallerstein now, but it's not my intention. Is the liberal state that is emerging out of these inequalities, or is the liberal state which is creating these inequalities?
Ariadna.
Well, it's a huge question, isn't it? We'd have to go bit by bit with an example by example, institution by institution. So I'll just take the opportunity to talk about taxation, which is freshest in my mind. And taxation is really interesting because liberal taxation early in the 19th century sought to be proportional. Okay, so instead of having a fixed rate for absolutely everybody, you have a fixed proportion for everybody, you know, a proportion of your income for certain forms of taxation, of direct taxation. I'm talking about direct taxation. And what I found is that, you know, even in places like the Puebla Sierra, where, you know, what was called contribuciones personales, which was direct taxation charged by state governments, and in the case of Puebla, administered by municipal governments for a long time, for most of the 19th century. What I found is that they often changed the rate, but it wasn't really properly proportional. So, you know, this obviously has consequences in terms of, you know, it ended up being a lot more regressive than it was supposed to be, basically. And it was only proportional. It wasn't even progressive taxation yet, because that wasn't on the cards yet. That would only be discussed in the early 20th century. You know, and this is a region where it probably worked as best as it could. I think Estado de Mexico is the Paolo,
Yeah.
I've forgotten
Riguzzi.
his surname. Paolo Riguzzi has studied this for the Estado de Mexico, and he found something very similar to what I found. So, you know, there was an intention that it was, less regressive. And it was in so far as they didn't keep exactly the same rate, although in some cases they even kept the same rate. I mean, in some municipalities they kept 50 cents for everybody. So, but then it changed municipality by municipality, so it's crazy. But I'd say from what I've seen for Puebla and for Estado de Mexico, that, you know, the proportional taxation worked only some periods and not properly, basically, you know. So that's one way in which something that was supposed to go against inequalities actually couldn't do that much, or did rather very little, you know.
Daniela, you can get away with, you know, you can the coincidence of attempts to move taxation towards the direct taxation and these waves of land reforms. That is throughout Spanish America. Both things happen very much at the same time. So there must be something, Ariadna, behind that.
Estoy de acuerdo con lo que dice Ariadna. Si yo no encuentro gran diferencia y no creo que la reforma de tierras haya llevado a romper esas desigualdades previas.
Thanks. I should maybe just add as well, if you look at military recruitment, which is a kind of tax as well, you know, that's also extremely regressive. You know, in terms of federal law, it's very nice and individualized and individuated, and everyone is equally eligible to it. But by the time it reaches jefes políticos and municipal governments, it's a punitive tax on poor and unprotected people. So you get a very regressive tax as well in practice. Yeah.
Yo en Huixquilucan, por ejemplo, no encuentro registros de quiénes pagaban la contribución, pero sí, por ejemplo, hay registro de cómo se distribuían las cargas de trabajo. Entonces, los notables, o sea, los no indios, ellos integraban, por ejemplo, la guardia a caballo, que tenían que dar una ronda por los límites de la municipalidad cada tanto, ¿no? Ellos ocupaban el cargo de jefe de guardia, el cargo de cobrador de rentas, el cargo de juez conciliador, ¿no? Además, obviamente, de los cargos municipales. Y a los indios les tocaba hacer las patrullas, ¿no? O sea, el jefe de guardia a caballo era no indio, pero los que iban a patrullar los límites del municipio, pues eran los indios, ¿no? Después de la lluvia, si había que arreglar los caminos, pues obviamente la mano de obra pues, era indígena, ¿no? Si había que arreglar la iglesia o la escuela, pues la mano de obra era indígena. Entonces, si bien no tengo registro de las cargas económicas, pues dado cómo se distribuían las cargas de trabajo, pues no me queda ninguna duda que de igual manera debía ser, ¿no?
Okay, well, that's been a really interesting discussion. If it's okay now, should we draw things to a close and just sort of, okay, so at the end of the discussion, usually we sort of stick around for another 15 minutes or so, so people can kind of talk informally, say hello in these very weird times that we live in. So we'll do that. I should also say you should all feel free to join us in a couple of weeks when we're having another seminar, and we are talking to Gemma Klopp Santa Maria about her new book on political violence and lynching in Mexico, in post-revolutionary Mexico, and she'll be talking to Nat Morris about that, so please join us for that. But having said all that, please join me in thanking our speakers today, Daniela and Ariadna, for a really stimulating discussion. And you should all feel free to turn your mics on and applaud in the normal way.